Well, Kristinn is a very important investigative reporter from Iceland. Now he's the main editor for Wikileaks. And you are touring many countries, Argentina among those countries, interviewing presidents. Why?
Well, we are trying to save a life, but not just a life of one man, the future for journalism. I'm referring to Julian Assange, who is now in prison in London, fighting against an extradition to the United States. It has become abundantly clear that the legal process is tainted. We have no faith in the legal process that he will get any justice in London courts. We describe it as a lawfare, and everybody who investigates the case now understands that Julian Assange is a political prisoner. He is a subject of a political persecution. The indictment against him is a revenge of an empire. So it is now very urgent to start to mobilize the political front in appealing to the Biden administration to stop this process. So thereby, we need to get those voices together, the voices that have been silent, and create a coordinated voice in appealing to the Biden to do the right thing. This is the start, and the reception we have received has been astonishingly good. We started in Colombia and met with Gustavo Petro, the president, who declared his full support. Secondly, we stopped in Brasilia and met with President-elect Lula, who was also very supportive. And now we came to Buenos Aires and met with President Fernandez and Vice President Cristina, and got the same good support. We appeal to these presidents, and we have not stopped here, to create a unified voice. Each and every voice that I've mentioned here on the highest political level is very important, but a unified position is of utmost importance. Eyes are now on Latin America, and a unified Latin American voice in saying to the Biden administration, you have to stop this, will have an effect. And I am sure that it has already had an effect, because in mid-journey, after we met President-elect Lula, the Prime Minister of Australia, Albanese, finally spoke out and said that he would take this matter up as a question of urgency and appeal to the Biden administration to end the case against Julian Assange. Enough is enough, he said.
The case against Julian Assange is supported by the idea that he's not a journalist, that the material, the news he got from being a hacker was useful for some kind of illegal operations against democracy. What do you say about that?
Well, this is propaganda point. We call it the Pentagon talking points. There is no merit to that, these accusations. To start with, this was a normal journalistic practice to receive information from a source, evaluate it, curate it, and actually create a media alliance to publish it. And we were working with more than 100 media organizations all around the world, including the biggest powerhouses in media in our times, the New York Times, The Guardian, El País, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and more than 100 others. So this was a standard journalistic practice. Julian Assange is a journalist. He has been a member of the Journalist Union in Australia since 2008, a card-holding member. He has received the highest journalistic award in Australia, the Pulitzer Prize of Australia, so to speak. And on top of that, Wikileaks and Julian Assange, since 2010, on the basis of this information that he is indicted for, he has received more than 24 awards internationally. So there is no question about the journalism side of what he did and we did with the material. There is this mention that there was some political aspect to it. Well, the only political aspect to the publication of the material is exposing wrongdoing, exposing corruption, exposing war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that is what journalists are supposed to be doing. If it has a political dimension, so be it. That is the politics of journalism.
But that was during the first intelligence big leaks, right? Back to 2010. But then during the elections that Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump, there was a leak related to Hillary's campaign in which you would, why was that exposed, since you didn't have emails from the Trump campaign, you would be only hurting the Hillary campaign?
Well, if somebody was hurt by these documents, you should actually take it up with the Hillary camp, because it's their documents. And no journalist worth his salt will get important information and say, okay, I'll hold that. I cannot publish that because I don't have anything from the other side. It's not the case. It's not the standard journalistic practice.
No potential crimes. It was just internal stuff, conversations among the staff of a campaign. What's the public interest?
Well, the public interest was obvious. The public interest was exposing the fact that the party machine was rigging the game against Bernie Sanders, for example. It was exposing the fact that Hillary Clinton was saying one thing publicly and saying another thing to her private donors, the Wall Street bankers. And she actually said that in a speech she had made for money in Wall Street. She said, I will tell you one thing, I will tell another thing publicly. So that is exposing what the politics is about, and it's in the public interest. And if you need any proof about the public interest, bear in mind that every major publication in the United States, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others, did base stories on these revelations. So there is no doubt about the public interest, and in the legal case I mentioned, but the judge came to the conclusion this is First Amendment protected journalistic practices. It's not only Wikileaks and Julian Assange's right to do it, it's the duty of journalists to publish material of this nature.
Even if that leak comes from a foreign government willing to intervene in a campaign so as to one candidate to lose the election, or some betting on one candidate to win that election, even if you're being...
Journalists must come to one conclusion. If somebody, it doesn't matter who gives you material, and let's just imagine a scenario. You're in your office and somebody slides a brown envelope under your door. You have no idea where it comes from. You open it, you see it, it's very explosive material, it's very newsworthy, it's in the public interest, it's real, it's not fabricated. What do? You publish it. You don't have a choice, you have a duty to publish it. So you can take out of the equation any intention of any individual activity behind the obtaining of the material. And it is constitutionally protected in the United States. It's constitutionally protected in many other countries, that a journalist has the right to publish documents, even if they were illegally obtained to begin with, if they pass the criteria of public interest. But it's very important to add to this, that the indictments against Julian have nothing to do with 2016, nothing to do with the election, nothing to do with the leaks from the CIA exposing their cyber arsenal and the capabilities, nothing to do with anything else. The indictment, the 18 counts, 175 years in prison, is based on the expose of the illegality in the Iraq War, the Afghan War, the Guantanamo files which exposed the extraordinary conditions which brought the people to come there in the first place, etc., and the diplomatic cables. These are the basis of the indictment of Julian Assange. They call it espionage. It's criminalizing journalism. It's a grave threat to press freedom worldwide.
Which is the limit? How do you establish a strong difference between espionage and journalism? Because it can happen that a spy or intelligence agency gets some information to try to damage any enemy, another country, a political party, a leader that they don't want, and filtered the information to a journalist. The information is true, it is in public interest, but it is obvious that there is a kind of shadow, you say, in the shadow there is an interest of operate the journalism to get some political goal or anything like that. How do you get I'm asking about the curation method, or how do you decide what to publish or not when the source is like kind of dark?
Well, the good thing about Wikileaks overall is the fact that we don't want to know who is the source. We want to protect the source. Not knowing who is the source is the best protection of the source. And it also takes that problem away, because the problem shouldn't be there. We base our scientific journalism on original documents of political, historic, or diplomatic interest. And by taking away that choice or that question about possible motives is simply the best way of dealing with it. You should prima facie just look at the documents like every journalist should do, in my opinion. And you don't have to evaluate. If you start evaluating whether this is going to have such and such political impact, then you're partisan. Then you become tainted in your journalistic objective. And I'm totally against that. Material speaks for itself. If it's a truth, if it's in the public interest to be out there, it should be published. And there is nobody, not a single entity has claimed...
Assange was not partisan at any point.
Not in the publishing activity on the material that is the basis of the indictment. We can discuss later publications, but let's focus on the indictment. Why it is so serious.
Indictment has to do with the first big leak, 2010, right?
It has to do with the collateral murder video showing the assassination, as I call it, of innocent civilians, a clear war crime, which I worked on directly in my own capacity when I was a media partner of Wikileaks. Then I joined them full time. Then it was the Iraq documents exposing criminality in Iraq, Afghanistan documents doing the same thing, assassination squad, extrajudicial killings, and what have you. And then there was the diplomatic cables exposing the underbelly of US diplomacy in the world.
And what about putting American spies on the field on danger? Some of those leaks, some people said that endangered the lives of people that were working on the fields in very difficult conditions for the American government.
Yeah, well, I could say that a cartoon in Página 12 would put in some people's life at risk. It's just empty words, it's propaganda. There has not been a single incident since 2010 where the American government has been able to say that anybody has been harmed as a result of the leaks. That's extraordinary, actually. I mean, of course, information is never neutral. When they claim that we put people's life at risk, it's empty words. We said, well, where is the evidence? And bear in mind that when Chelsea Manning, who we now know was the source of this information, was put on court-martial, a Pentagon official had to admit under oath in the court-martial that they did not have a single incident of any harm as a result of this exposure. So you have simple, no fact to substantiate or back up this claim. So it's empty words. It is one of the propagandas that they are constantly hammering on. And bear in mind also that we did curate the material very diligently. This Iraq and Afghan material, even to the extent that we were criticized for over-redacting material. When it came to the diplomatic cables, we worked for 10 months diligently with our media partner, trusting their expertise on the ground in their region to redact names and publish nothing except after they had evaluated to be secure. So this empty words of data dumping, putting lives at risk, it's only that. It's empty words. It's not substantiated by any facts.
Kristinn, I would like you to tell the people who is watching this show what happened to Julian Assange since he published the first Wikileaks up to now. How was his life?
Well, I mean, Wikileaks has a story before 2010. It is not until we were starting to publishing the material exposing the empire that the reaction became this strong. But since then, Julian Assange has been deprived of freedom for 12 years now in one way or the other. He was under house arrest in the United Kingdom, then he spent 7 years as an asylee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and now for 3.5 years he's been a prisoner in the maximum security prison in London, a political prisoner in my opinion, waiting the outcome of the extradition proceedings which had been dragging on and on. He's been denied bail, and spending a time in a prison built for terrorists and murderers is a human rights abuse in itself. And the process has been prolonged, it's dragging on. We call it that Julian Assange is now being punished through process, because they don't have any case. They don't have any case, in essence.
Why would they judge him? What's the force behind the extradition process?
It's raw revenge of the empire. It is to send a signal to journalists all around the world. If you expose our secrets, if you expose our wrongdoing, we will come after you wherever you are. It's claiming universal jurisdiction. We're talking about an Australian citizen who published in England, in Germany, Sweden, and my home country, Iceland. There is no jurisdictional territory in the United States. They claim, they throw on him a more than 100-year-old Espionage Act, which take away a public interest defense possibility. You cannot defend yourself on the basis of public interest. He's the first journalist, he's the first publisher ever to be indicted on the basis of this Espionage Act.
But, I mean, there is something strange or exotic in this story, because there is a long tradition in the United States of publishing things that in some way reveals things that the state doesn't want to be revealed. The Pentagon Papers, the Watergate, and a lot of, when I say this, my mind is all the time referred to the Vietnam War, but there are there is a big tradition in the American papers to reveal this kind of thing, and there has not been this kind of process I have never seen.
You call it a tradition when there are 50 years in between, because you mentioned the Pentagon Papers of '73 and the expose of the Watergate case and the resignation of Nixon. This is 50 years ago. Nothing equal to those episodes in journalism happened until Wikileaks in 2010. So it was 50 years in between. And I can tell you about the Pentagon Papers because I know Daniel Ellsberg, who was the leaker of the Pentagon Papers. He told me that if he would be facing the same kind of judicial criminality and politicized process and persecution as is now the case back in the early 70s, he would have never been able to go free as a free man. So things have changed. Things are now worse with respect to this than it was in the 70s during the dark Nixon era. Think about that. Things are worse now. The sources are being hunted down, whistleblowers are being thrown in jail, people who expose truth are thrown in jail, but not the people who are responsible for the illegal acts. I'll give you one example. John Kiriakou is a former CIA officer who exposed the torture program of the CIA to the media. He was sent to prison for exposing the torture program of the CIA. Horrible torture program in the dark sites. He is the only person who has gone to jail in the United States for the CIA torture. Not the torturers, the man who exposed it. And that is the reality, that is a changed reality since the 70s. We have to come to the realization that we are worse off today than we were in the 70s.
You mentioned the cooperation initially you had with some media outlet as the New York Times in the United States. It took the New York Times like many years to come out and support the case you're making now against Assange extradition to the United States. Why?
Well, you have to ask them why on earth they took them 10 years or more than 10 years to come to the realization that the case against Julian Assange was putting their interest in grave danger. And that is the reason why all major press freedom organizations and international organizations are fighting for Julian Assange. It is not per se because of the person, it is because of the principle. It is because if you criminalize journalism, you will come to the point where you are gravely damaging the press freedom principles. And I want to point out that under President Obama, the Department of Justice did try to find an angle to bring up a case against Julian Assange. The lawyers at the Department of Justice came to the conclusion that it was too dangerous because it would threaten the First Amendment principle in the United States, because there was no distinction between what Julian Assange did and Wikileaks did and what the New York Times did, our media partner. It was the same principle in obtaining information, curating information, publishing information. How can you go after one and not the other? And they called it the New York Times problem, decided not to bring charges against Julian. It was under Donald Trump and the highly politicized Department of Justice, everybody agrees to that today, that they overstepped completely and decided to bring charges against Julian on the basis of this archaic legal framework called the Espionage Act, causing a grave threat to journalism. Now, all these big media partners that I mentioned before have come together. Only a week ago, they published a declaration where they urged the Biden administration to drop the charges. The New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and El País. So everybody sees the gravity of the situation. And we must stop this, because it's a pivotal point. If Julian Assange is extradited, there is no turning back. It has already then had a grave implication for the work of journalists all over the world.
Kristinn, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thanks for having me.